por su presentación. Nos invita a seguir comprendiendo y tratando de adelantar acciones que permitan prohibir el asbesto. A continuación, el doctor Arthur Frank, médico de la Escuela de Medicina del Monte Sinaí, en la ciudad de Nueva York, y doctor en Ciencias Biomédicas de la Universidad de Nueva York. Actualmente es profesor titular de Salud Pública del Departamento de Salud Ocupacional y Ambiental de la Universidad de Dresden en Filadelfia, Pensilvania. El doctor Frank entonces va a dirigir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really quite an honor to be here with you. As Dr. Castleman said, it's hard to follow Fernando Gianassi, and it's hard to follow Barry Castleman. But the three of us have been in settings like this before, and I consider them my dear friends, and together we have tried to do something about asbestos in the world. What I'd like to do today with you is talk about some of the medical aspects and public health aspects of where one gets exposed to asbestos and the diseases that one gets from. Fernanda has already shown you the pictures of what is asbestos. She's already shown you the various pictures. The word asbestos comes from the ancient Greek word unquenchable. The Greeks knew about the uses of asbestos. The Romans used asbestos. But the modern era of asbestos goes back really to the late 1800s, when there started to be asbestos textiles made and other uses of asbestos. And as you've seen twice already, the large amount that was used that peaked in the 1970s with continuing amounts of asbestos being very high. So why are we concerned about this? What, as they say, what is the big deal about asbestos? And what I would like to do in the time I have with you is take you on a trip from the laboratory to the bedside to populations and maybe even beyond that. What we have here is it doesn't show very well, but it is what we call an asbestos body. I will show you a cleaner one a bit later. This is a piece of tissue that was taken at an autopsy, post-mortem examination, in the year 1899. A young man of 36 told his doctor that he and 9 other young men had started working in the local asbestos factory at the East End of London. And he told his doctor that the other 9 men had died and now he was dying and was the 10th and last to die of respiratory insufficiency. When Dr. Montague Murray did his post-mortem examination, this was the piece of tissue with an asbestos body clearly documented in that tissue. So this is really not a new problem. And in fact, in the year 1906, Dr. Murray wrote, "One hears, generally speaking, that considerable trouble is now taken to prevent the inhalation of dust, and so the disease is not so likely to occur as heretofore." That's more than 100 years ago. They thought they had the problem solved. But as we sit here now in the 21st century, this is the spectrum of asbestos-related disease. We have benign disease, that is, disease that is not cancer. A minor problem with asbestos warts, it gets in the skin, something called benign asbestotic pleural effusion. This is where the fibers irritate the lining in the chest wall and cause fluid to build up in the lung. Not very common, but is seen. But in some populations, up to 10% of workers die of asbestosis, scarring of the lungs. Now, there are many dusts that will scar the lungs. Silica dust, coal dust, mica, a long list. But asbestos was one of the earliest ones that was appreciated to cause scarring of the parenchyma of the lung itself, and the pleura, the lining around the lung. What makes asbestos very unusual is that it causes many different kinds of cancer. Again, in some groups, 20% of workers die of lung cancer. In another group that's been looked at, mesothelioma, which exists in the general population, probably 1 in a million people, 1 in a million, kills 10% of all the workers. Now, this is data from the United States. There's very good data from Europe. There's good data from some other countries around the world. There is not good data from some of the places that you've heard about, Brazil, Russia. There's not good data from India. Now, isn't this striking? The places where they use the most asbestos, they have poor record keeping. And a very important principle of public health is the lack of data doesn't mean the lack of disease. I've been working in India for more than a dozen years. They have not a single recorded case of mesothelioma, but one hospital alone in 1 year treated 32 cases of mesothelioma that never got recorded by the government. Excuse me. The other diseases you get from exposure to asbestos, besides mesothelioma, are gastrointestinal cancers, esophagus, stomach, colorectal cancers, laryngeal cancers, oropharyngeal cancers, renal cancers, and in women, ovarian cancers. So this is a very deadly material. The World Health Organization, as you've heard, estimates 107,000 deaths per year worldwide. This is among 125 million workers who are exposed to asbestos. This is a serious problem on a worldwide basis. Parts of the world are dealing with it well, parts are not. In the laboratory, you can identify asbestos. Fernanda showed you some pictures. This is a polarizing light microscopy. You can identify the fibers as asbestos. You can use electron microscopy. This is chrysotile, the type that 95% of the world's use has been of this chrysotile. And again, if you remember only one thing from today, all forms of asbestos, including chrysotile, cause all of these diseases. No matter what the advertisements in the newspapers say, no matter what the industry tells you, they all cause disease. And it's not just Arthur Frank saying this. It is American agencies like our National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. It is the World Health Organization. It is the International Labor Office. It is the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And I could go on and on about all the agencies who don't sell asbestos, but have looked at the science and agree that it causes disease, including mesothelioma. You can do other electron microscopy. You can even do X-ray diffraction, more than we need to go into today. This is a better looking asbestos body. I don't want to scare you or make you too concerned, but everybody in this room has some asbestos in their lungs. It's a naturally occurring material. It's been widely used in our societies all over the world, and we all have some very low levels in our lung. That does not mean anybody's going to get disease. But the principle is, as you increase the amount of exposure, you increase the likelihood of getting disease. We'll show you data on that. This is the scarring of lung tissue. It should be very thin and lacy. This is the kind of scarring that one sees. This is the X-ray appearance. It should be black like at the top, but you see that it's much more white at the bottom where you get the asbestosis. This is lung with a thick rind around it. Think of it like the wrapper around an orange. It's a casing around the lung. This is from a chrysotile asbestos miner from Canada who died with his lungs compressed so that he couldn't breathe. In 1955, we had the first epidemiological evidence that asbestos could cause lung cancer. Now, it had been suggested earlier. It was actually in textbooks as far back as 1942. But we now had epidemiology, population studies. Richard Dahl in Great Britain showed that in a series of asbestos works, there should have been 4% of deaths from lung cancer. Instead, there were 17%. And he said, asbestos causes lung cancer. This is what a lung cancer might look like, a mass in the lung. It is the same kind of lung cancer you get from many, many other things that cause lung cancer. Arsenic and beryllium and chromium and tobacco smoke and radiation. And asbestos, including chrysotile, is one of those substances that cause lung cancer. Now, I just mentioned tobacco. For those of you that have never seen a picture of tobacco, here's a field of tobacco. I spent more than a decade teaching at the University of Kentucky in the United States, a big tobacco growing state. This was actually a field of tobacco very near my house. And the reason tobacco and asbestos are important is the following. If you don't smoke and you don't work with asbestos, the risk of getting lung cancer is very, very low. It's 1. If you work with asbestos but don't smoke, 5 times the risk of getting lung cancer. If you smoke, the average 1 pack a day cigarette smoker, but don't work with asbestos, about a 10 times increased risk of lung cancer. But if you work with asbestos and you smoke, it's not added together, it is multiplied. And there are other combinations like that that we know from the scientific literature. So it is very important, and as a practicing physician, I have always told workers who work with asbestos to stop smoking. If you can get them to stop smoking, their risk from the tobacco goes away, just as it does in smokers in the real world, who you can get to stop smoking, but the asbestos risk always continues to be there. This is the other serious cancer in the chest we see from asbestos. It's a mesothelioma, a cancer of the chest lining. I'll show you some pictures of that. You also get other things like these big calcium deposits in the chest. You get calcium deposited on the diaphragm. This is one of the side effects of asbestos. This is a chest that's just loaded with mesothelioma. And this was an asbestos worker, and his belly is that way because he has a mesothelioma in his abdominal cavity, which is soon after this picture going to cause his death. The hospital that I trained at in New York, at Mount Sinai Hospital, actually had an interesting history about mesothelioma. In 1931, Dr. Rabin reported a single case of mesothelioma. He read the scientific literature. He found 3 other cases. That's all. Another doctor at Mount Sinai suggested that mesothelioma was not a real disease. And so for the next 30 years, these 2 doctors had a friendly discussion and looked for new mesotheliomas. So from 1930 to 1960, there was 1 case every decade. 1 per million patients. There were 100,000 patients per year at our hospital. So in 1960, it was striking when from South Africa, Dr. Wagner reported at one mine over 30 cases of mesothelioma that he saw in a 4-year period, all related to exposure to asbestos. And what was important about that, he saw it in the miners. That's not a surprise. But he saw it in family members, people who lived with the miners. They brought it home. And he also reported people living in the same village getting mesothelioma who didn't work in the mine and didn't live with a miner. So it's what we call neighborhood exposure. And we'll talk about that a little more later. Now here's the data that shows that all the different types of asbestos cause all of these diseases. This is animal data, the same Dr. Wagner. All of the different kinds of asbestos cause both lung cancers, carcinoma, and mesothelioma. And interestingly, if you look at crucidolite, which some people say is the most hazardous, I don't believe that, and chrysotile from Canada, which they said was safe, which it isn't, they got exactly the same number of mesotheliomas in the animals. Now you might say, how much asbestos does it take to produce these diseases? We see that all the fibers do it, but how much? The same study showed this. 1 day of exposure to these animals gave some of them lung cancer and some of them mesothelioma. And as you got longer into the experiment, the numbers got higher, the classical dose-response curve. Do we know of cases in human beings of 1 day of exposure? The answer is yes. Not many, because most people don't have just 1 day. But there are cases of mesotheliomas in people from 1 day of exposure. And what about lung cancer? This is a study that when I was much younger and starting out in the asbestos world, I've been doing asbestos work for about 45 years now. If you look at the data, if you worked at this asbestos factory for 1 month or less, that could be a week, 2 weeks, or a month, you doubled your risk for lung cancer, and by the time you worked at this factory for 2 years, your risk was 7 times that if you hadn't worked there. When does the disease occur? If I expose somebody, if I dump a bucket of asbestos over your heads today, will you get disease next week or next year? Absolutely not. You first see disease at about 10 years, but it doesn't peak until you're out at 35, 40, 45 years. But these are workers who started when they were 16 or 18. And so even 40 years later, they are still relatively young people dying of lung cancers, peritoneal mesotheliomas, and pleural mesotheliomas. I have to sit here and tell you that as much as we have tried to understand how asbestos causes cancer, we don't know. I have a second doctoral degree besides my medical degree, and I studied in animals how asbestos affects tissue. And all I want to show you is these 2 slides. This is normal tissue lining the inside of the lungs. You see the little finger-like projections? That's normal. Humans have that. You see the cells. I'm going to now show you a picture of what happens 2 days after you give the tissue exposure to asbestos. You get many more cells. This is not cancer, but it is a process that is the early stages of what you expect to see cancer many, many weeks, months, or even in humans, years later. So where does one become exposed to asbestos. You've heard from Fernanda about mining, you've seen pictures from Barry about various activities, so it's mining and milling, making products, installing asbestos, the construction industry, shipbuilding and ship repair, maintenance work, power plants, railroads, and then we'll also talk about household contact, we mentioned that already, consumer products, demolition and waste disposal, and other settings. Here's a unionized asbestos insulation worker in the United States. He's putting asbestos cement on a piece of pipe. It's not surprising that he will get the kinds of diseases we talked about. But in addition to this kind of work, there was also the spraying of asbestos. Spray insulation started in Great Britain in 1932, came to the United States in 1935, and by 1970, half of all multi-story buildings were being fireproofed with spray-on insulation. What do I mean by that? I don't know if you can recognize these two buildings, one under construction, one pretty much finished. That's the World Trade Center in New York when it was being built in 1970. This is a man working there, a union asbestos insulator, and he's spraying asbestos onto the steel girders. And as you see, some of it stayed on the beams. But what happened to the rest of it? This is what the laborer would have to come and sweep up. This is what the electrician was exposed to. This is what the brick mason was exposed to. You didn't have to work with asbestos to have exposure. What's going on? We're moving the prisoners out of death row. How come? They found asbestos in the ceilings. We are concerned about asbestos in buildings now in the United States. Here is, again, an asbestos insulator dumping out asbestos cement. Now, he's not wearing a proper respirator, but if you look in the back on the right, there's another man there. He's not an insulator. He might be a carpenter, a plumber, an electrician. He is what we call a bystander. He gets exposed in the same workplace. This man belongs to the painters union. He's smoothing out asbestos-containing material on the walls. It's a construction technique widely used in the United States. And then when the wall is smooth, they can paint it. These workers have come down with mesotheliomas. This is the inside of a ship. All of that gray material, those blocks on the floor, those are all asbestos-containing materials. And at one shipyard in Great Britain, Dr. Harris studied the cases of asbestosis. In 10 years, he had 156 cases of asbestosis in one shipyard, and he had 55 cases of mesothelioma. Now, this is in a country that had good regulations that were supposedly enforced. If you hear that there's regulations and they are protecting workers any place in the world, do not believe it. So, if you look at the list, the sprayers and laggers, of which there were 2 mesotheliomas out of 55, the others were all other trades that didn't work with asbestos, but were exposed. There's some excellent research coming here in Columbia from university professors here who have studied automotive mechanics and the exposure they have to asbestos brakes. In America alone, there are 1 million workers who are exposed to brakes, and they have gotten lung cancer and mesothelioma, as well as asbestosis. That's been shown here in Columbia. Again, not recorded, but it has occurred. So we've talked about occupational exposures. Now let's turn to some of these other settings, community and consumer products. Here is the x-ray of a young man. He was 28 years old with this x-ray picture. He had presented to his doctor with discomfort in his chest. It took 4 months till they opened his chest, because you don't think of cancer in a 28-year-old young man. And they found that he had a diffuse malignant pleural mesothelioma. They found asbestos in his lung, and he died just before his 30th birthday. He had never worked with asbestos. He had studied accounting at university, and he was working as a bookkeeper. How did he get a mesothelioma? Well, as part of our study of him, we took a geographic history. He was born in Brooklyn and lived on Ross Street and later on Wilson Street. Here's the asbestos we actually found in his lung. And here we have, over here, Ross Street and Wilson Street. And here we have the Brooklyn Naval Shipyard. I showed you all that asbestos on ships. It doesn't stay at the shipyard. It doesn't stop at the factory gates. It spills out into the neighborhood. And so this young man, 30 years before, as a baby, started being exposed to asbestos living near a shipyard. I come from Pennsylvania. I teach in Philadelphia. Not far from there is this pile. It's 30 meters high of asbestos waste material, which local children play on. It shouldn't occur. Our government hasn't regulated it. There's now, after at least 4 decades, going to be a study of disease in the population living near these piles of asbestos waste. In London, I started by telling you the case of the young man who died at the London hospital. Years later, Dr. Newhouse studied all of the cases of mesothelioma at this one hospital in London, right near the same asbestos factory. She found 76 cases. Half of them roughly had industrial exposure. 9 were relatives who lived with workers from the factory. And 11 cases were people who lived within half a mile of the factory. Neighborhood exposure. The ones where it says no known exposure, it's because in 1910 and 1920, none of the doctors were asking about, did you have exposure to asbestos? In Finland, where they closed an asbestos mine, in County A, where they had this mine, they looked at 6,300 x-rays, and 499 of them had the calcifications that I showed you clinically earlier. In County B, with no mine, 7,100 x-rays, not a single x-ray with calcification. This is Washington, D.C., capital of the United States. Here is Bethesda, that's where the National Cancer Institute is, where I spent some time working. And just off the picture is a place called Rockville, Maryland. And they call it Rockville because they used to take these rocks out of a quarry there. And the veins that you see running through the rock are asbestos. They would crush these rocks and use it to pave roadways in that area. So maybe it's not so bad to be in the truck, but I'm not sure I want to be breathing the dust in the car behind. They also used it in school playgrounds. If you come to my office, literally sitting on the top of one of my bookcases is this can, big bright red can. It says, leak-proof asbestos liquid roof coating. Fernanda told you there were between 3,000 and 4,000 products. This was roofing material. It's about 50 years old, this can, but it was one of many, many uses where people would be exposed to asbestos. Here are some school children. The same waste material that the children were playing on were made into material for arts and crafts at schools. And so the students were making what they call the asbestos head. Here we have, from the same county where we have the National Cancer Institute, the fire department says, have a fire safe and Merry Christmas. Number 14, use glass wool or asbestos snow for decorating. you were supposed to sprinkle asbestos on your tree. And perhaps the ultimate irony, there was once a brand of cigarettes that were made with asbestos filters. So every time you would get a puff of your cancer-causing materials from your cigarettes, you'd also be getting little bits of asbestos from the filters. Now, as a doctor, I prescribe medications for patients. They don't do it anymore, but they used to allow asbestos filters to filter pharmaceutical drugs, and I would be injecting asbestos into my patients when I use these medications. In the background is the Mount Sinai Hospital, where I trained, where I learned about the hazards of asbestos. In the front, you see an old apartment building that's being demolished, huge amount of dust. Nobody bothered to control for all the asbestos that would have been in that building. And even inside the hospital, this is asbestos pipe wrap coming off steam pipes inside the hospital. They load this material in the old days on the back of a truck. They drive through the middle of New York City with the asbestos blowing out of the back of the truck. And since the truck was small, they stored it under the main air intake for the hospital. So all of the patients could breathe the asbestos. Years later, I'm teaching at another university, and we had asbestos problems there. As you see here, this is now at the University of Kentucky. Bicycles would be tied up with pipes that were covered with asbestos. That's probably an asbestos ironing board cover there. But now when they do removal, the workers have to dress in proper suits. They wear respirators that are appropriate for asbestos. They use proper vacuums with the proper filters on them to cut down on exposure. They use water to suppress dust, and then they filter the asbestos out of the water. They do air measurements to make sure they're not causing further contamination when they remove the asbestos. They put the asbestos inside drums and then bury the drums in hazardous waste sites, not with municipal garbage. Now, we're in a one-world marketplace, Globot. We have to produce to the same high standards right around the globe. What about health and safety standards? That depends which part of the world you work in. That's this textile part of the factory, asbestos lying all over the place, no proper protection, cotton gauze masks that aren't going to keep the asbestos out. There's a whole story in this one picture. I have done research in China since 1991. The gentleman in the foreground at the time was the dean of the School of Public Health in Beijing. He went on to be head of the whole Centers for Disease Control in all of China. The gentleman in the white coat in the back was the local factory doctor. He was not a gynecologist. He was properly trained, and he tried as best he could to take care of his workers. The lady with the little girl was a factory worker, and this picture was taken on a Saturday. It was her usual day off, but she came in to do overtime and work in the textile area. She didn't have anybody to watch her 3-year-old daughter, so she brings her daughter to her workplace, exposing her to asbestos. So nobody appreciated the potential hazards for children. And I hate to tell you, but there are now articles from China that the children of asbestos workers have ended up getting mesotheliomas. Not a surprise. Legal issues. Barry Castleman spent a lot of time talking about some of the criminal activities, but most of the legal activities is to compensate injured workers. And I do a lot of such medical legal work. I do some workers' compensation, third-party suits. I won't go into all of that. But the law is a very powerful tool in getting companies to behave better. There was a significant prevention literature, as Dr. Castleman said, by 1930. And let me finish with this. I showed you the asbestos going into the World Trade Center. This, of course, is a very famous picture. It's the World Trade Center coming down. There is lots of dust. A lot of that is concrete dust, but not all of it. Here are the steel beams that were sprayed, in many cases with asbestos. Here is downtown New York City. Up to 4% of the dust samples that some people measured had up to 4% asbestos in them. So there was a lot of asbestos in this dust all over New York City. And again, you see the insulation material on the beams. Do you know what happened to all of those beams from the two buildings? A few of them went into museums. A few of them built a new US Navy ship. But most of the beams were sent to India and to China to recycle the steel and use it again. But they never bothered to take off the asbestos. They shipped them over and let the Chinese and the Indians, because they would do it, they had no regulations, they would then take the asbestos off. So the diseases that we talked about from dusts, like asbestos, are best treated by prevention. If you prevent exposure, you will not get disease, and the diseases you get are very difficult to treat. And let's think of the legacies of the past and look to the future. In terms of health, even if we stopped using asbestos everywhere in the world tomorrow, we will still have disease 50 years from now because of the latency. In some countries, as you've heard, they still use a lot of asbestos. Engineering controls are not well developed. They talk about regulatory feasibility. We regulate, but the enforcement of regulations everywhere in the world is sorely lacking, is very poor. There are all kinds of legal issues which you've heard about. And at least in America, we know that there are 25 million tons of asbestos in buildings sitting there. People got sick putting the asbestos in. We can only hope that they do not get sick taking the asbestos out. So that is my story with you. That's our little trip through the clinical and medical world and exposure world of asbestos. So thank you very much for your